everyone. My name is Dr. Toriana Heidel. I am a first-year resident at Cincinnati Children's in Peds, Psych, and Child Psych. I want to welcome you to How to Do CAP Research Workshop Series, a DEI initiative sponsored by ACAP, the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry's AMSOM grant. This month's series aims to address the barriers to entry into research by providing an overview of fundamental research skills and showcasing the diversity of child and adolescent mental health research topics, as well as research mentors. The series is intended for individuals at all career stages interested in child and adolescent psychiatry research and the incorporation of diversity, equity, and inclusivity principles into their research endeavors. We hope to inspire individuals from diverse backgrounds and at all career stages to participate in research, explore ACAP resources, and apply for ACAP research opportunities. Throughout the series, we featured diverse child and adolescent mental health researchers who will share their wide array of research topics and career wisdom and introduce foundational research concepts such as how to get started in research, finding a mentor, developing a research idea, finding funding support, presenting your work, and much, much more. Each session starts with the mentor sharing their career trajectory and using their own research to explain a foundational research concept. They will then close their discussion by sharing 5 overall pearls about engaging in child and adolescent psychiatry research. We will reserve the last 10 minutes for Q&A. During the session, please feel free to enter questions into the chat, and I will help share these questions during the Q&A portion of the session. You may also submit questions anonymously by submitting them as direct messages to me. Please note that the session is recorded. For our session today, we have the honor of inviting Dr. Cynthia Rogers. Dr. Rogers is the Vice Chair, the Director, and the Interim Section Chief for Research in the Division of Child Psychiatry at the Washington University in St. Louis. She is also the Psychiatrist in Chief at the St. Louis Children's Hospital and the founder and co-director of the Perinatal Behavioral Health Service. Her work is centered on how certain social determinants of health impact vulnerable and marginalized populations in both clinical and research settings. Her research focuses on how adverse exposures like poverty, structural racism, prematurity, and prenatal maternal mental health and substance use affect development across childhood and racially diverse populations. These investigations also include and emphasize on assessing the roles of psychosocial stressors, including maternal exposures and experiences of racial discrimination, maternal mental health, and the dysfunctional parenting, in affecting development of neonatal brain and contributing to childhood psychiatric disorders. Her research has appeared in the Journal of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, American Journal of Psychiatry, Biological Psychiatry, and Pediatrics, amongst others. She is the recipient of numerous grants and awards. In 2022, the National Academy of Medicine named Rogers an Emerging Leader in Health and Medicine Scholar. We're thrilled to have Dr. Rogers with us today. Dr. Rogers, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. That was a really kind introduction, and I'm really excited to talk to you all tonight. So I'm going to share my slides. And let me get rid of that. Can you all see that okay? I'm going to take that as a yes. Okay. All right. So let me get started with my career trajectory. So I'm starting way back. Starting in high school, I went to public high school in Louisville, Kentucky, and then I left there and went to Harvard. And I was already intending to become a physician, but I became really interested in the brain basis for mental health. And so I was a psychology major, focusing really on abnormal psychology, and did an honors thesis there as my first foray into research that was focused on cognitive aspects of eating disorders. After college, I was not quite ready to go to medical school, so I went to UCSF and worked with the PTSD research program. And that's when I became interested in adverse exposures. This was a long time ago, probably before maybe some of you were born. And it was when ACEs were really first, and the impact of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, were being investigated in research. And I went to a traumatic stress conference where they presented some of the first data linking ACEs to medical outcomes. And that's when I started to think about needing to do research as early as childhood, and thought more seriously about going into child psychiatry. So I worked with a research group there that was focused on a lot of biological aspects of PTSD. And that made my interest in biological psychiatry increase significantly. And they recommended that if I was interested in biological psychiatry, I should go to WashU for medical school. So that is what I did. And throughout medical school, I did different research electives just to continue to expose myself to research. Some were with pediatrics, some with psychiatry. I stayed at WashU for all of my clinical training because for many reasons, it's a fantastic place. And also my husband was an MD, PhD. And so he wasn't going anywhere, so I wasn't going anywhere. But during my residency, my general residency, I also was able to do some research electives, both my second year and my fourth year, and continued to recognize that research was the path that I wanted to pursue in academia. So I continued in St. Louis at St. Louis Children's Hospital with my child psychiatry fellowship in the division that I now direct, and did a research elective as part of my fellowship. And this is really the first experience that led to the research that I do now. I was really interested in understanding the impact of adversity on brain development. And at the time, there was a neonatologist who had an ongoing, recently started, but ongoing study of the preterm brain. And they were being scanned at birth, which I thought was really cool and amazing, and being followed up and scanned again in childhood. And I thought it would be interesting to see what happens to the brain between birth and later in childhood with exposure to adversity. And as I learned in working with the group, with Dr. Terry Ender, who's a neonatologist, preterm children are at higher risk for childhood psychiatric disorders. And also at higher risk for adverse exposures like child maltreatment, for instance. So it seemed like a really good way to start my research. So I stayed after I graduated fellowship. I did a postdoc for research, and then I was also on the clinical faculty. So at the same time that I was studying prematurity and the preterm brain, I started a clinic that was working with formerly preterm infants, co-located in newborn medicine, and doing early developmental assessments because I was very interested in infant mental health. And I was fortunate to be trained by Joe Luby here at WashU, who is really one of the international recognized experts in early childhood mental health. So I started that clinic, and at the same time also started a clinic that was focused on treating the mental health of the parents in the NICU, because the neonatologist I worked with described how challenging, having your child in the NICU was, and how there was a lot of untreated mental health in the parents there. So I had a clinic in the morning seeing the parents, a clinic in the afternoon seeing the children, and at the same time was developing my research, trying to look at the development of the preterm brain and childhood psychiatric disorders. So after I finished my postdoc, I applied for a Career Development Award, first a KL2, which is an institutional K, then a K23. And then this is when something pretty significant in my research path occurred. My mentor, Dr. Ender, and her husband at the time, Dr. Jeffrey Neal, who ran the lab, were recruited to Harvard, and they left. And they were checked to see if a lot of us that were working in the lab wanted to move. And so we investigated it, my husband and I, but decided that WashU was the best place for us because he also is a child psychiatry researcher who works in neuroimaging. So we stayed here, but then my main mentor was gone. And also the lab that I was doing my research in really didn't have much funding left. So I joined with a colleague of mine who was also a postdoc in the lab, Dr. Chris Miser, and we took over the lab and very quickly wrote an R01 grant, probably sooner than we would have, so that we could continue the longitudinal study that I'll talk about a little bit later, and also continue to have the lab running. Well, Dr. Ender, stayed as a mentor at another institution. Joan Luby became my primary mentor at WashU, and ultimately, what seemed like a really scary moment in my career actually turned out, honestly, for the best, and really put me on the path to where I am now. I was able, like I said, we were able to get that first R01, and I'll tell you about some of the other studies that we've had. But that has sort of led the path that I'm on now, which is as an independent investigator of several different longitudinal studies. Clinically, as I mentioned, I had started a clinic, but that evolved into a larger program that's called the Perinatal Behavioral Health Service. And so not only do we see parents in the NICU, we see parents all across both our adult and child hospital who have mental health disorders. And we have a perinatal substance use clinic. For research, I continue to co-run the lab, but we also have a new center called the Herman Center for Child and Family Development, a philanthropically endowed center that I am a co-executive director, that's focused on lots of different implementation research with early childhood populations. And then I also became the division director and vice chair about 2 years ago. So my job really involves clinical program leadership, research leadership, and administrative leadership. So happy to answer any questions about this lengthy path at the end when we have time for questions. So just to go a little bit more into the lab, it is multidisciplinary. Dr. Smizer is, like I said, a child neurologist. We have several high-risk infant cohorts, and our lab members, we're fortunate to have a fairly large lab that grew over time, because when Chris and I first started, we probably only had about maybe 5 of us, 4 or 5 of us that were in the lab. Now we probably have over 40 members of the lab, and they range from faculty, postdocs, grad students, as well as MD, PhD students, and residents, fellows, psychology and biology undergraduate students. So, and we have investigators that are from neuroradiology, neurology, psychology, and newborn medicine. Okay, so in terms of what I was asked to speak with you guys about tonight, the focus is on data, and what do we do with data and some of the challenges of the data that we acquire in research. So I wanted to start off sort of just thinking about the whole path from the very beginning of when you are at the point of sort of designing the study and acquiring data, all the way through. So when we're first designing a study, obviously we have hypotheses that we're investigating, which, sort of thinking about the scientific questions in some ways is the easier part of research. It's the implementation of how you're going to test those questions that is a little bit more challenging. So from the very beginning, you have to decide how large of a study is this going to be. And we're talking about clinical research here, right? So how many participants am I going to need to answer the questions that I'm trying to ask? And then you have to choose the measures. And one of the things that was mentioned earlier is that we have a lot of cohorts that are diverse. So, and for us, the diversity is mainly African Americans here in urban St. Louis, along with white participants and a few Latino participants. But when you're choosing measures, you have to think about, has this measure been validated in the populations that I'm interested in studying? And that, is it going to be appropriate for both, white participants, Black participants, and Latino participants, for instance? You need to think about the reading level of the measures, thinking about your cohort, and you need to think about the longitudinal aspect of our studies really makes us think about developmental concerns. So say you want to study executive function and you want to start during the preschool age. Well, the measures that you use to do that may not be the same measures that you use to do it when they're school age or adolescent. So you've got to think about, how am I going to be able to measure this construct over time if you're going to be doing longitudinal research, which a lot of research that's done in child psychiatry tends to be. And then you have to think about the burden to the participants, because if the participants think this is way too much and they're answering way too many questionnaires, they're not really going to focus on the questions toward the end, and the data that you acquire will not really be valid. So you really do have to think through how you acquire data. You have to think about what order you acquire it in and how much your participants can handle. So what we often do is we pilot test a lot of the things in our studies before we launch into them. And my daughter, bless her heart, has been in every phase pretty much of our preterm study, has been a pilot participant. Maintaining data. So this is a part of the data analysis people don't really think about ahead of time. You have to design some sort of database or databases to house your data. And if you do not do that well, analyzing your data will be an enormous pain and can really inhibit your ability to answer whatever scientific questions you have. At the same time, you have to ensure the quality of the data. So you need to be looking at the data and saying, does this make sense? Does the distribution of the data make sense? And so sometimes that means, and it also means making sure that what you enter is what the participant actually answered. And so we do a lot of double entry or using coding to make sure that the data is high quality. And so that's thinking about questionnaire data. And then for our imaging data, our neuroimaging data, we have to do the same thing. A lot of QC, making sure that the MRI images look like they should, there wasn't too much movement, and then lots of other sort of software that we utilize to help with data quality. And you also have to score the measures. So sometimes there's software that does it that can do it automatically for you, but that can cost more. Or you have to set up ways within your databases that can score the measures, or the worst way is when you have to score it by hand. And so these are all steps that you really have to think about when you're thinking about data analysis. So analyzing data is a little bit different than data analysis potentially. So when I'm talking about analyzing data here, so for instance, if you're getting MRI images, we then analyze that data to get brain volumes, to get brain microstructure, white matter microstructure, to get functional connectivity data, or if you did task-based MRI, fMRI, then getting task-based data. So you have to take what you acquired and then turn it into something meaningful, right? And then for behavioral data, if you're doing things like we do, like a parent-child interaction task, or other types of behavioral videotaped assessments, you have to code the data. And so that takes time, and you have to ensure the quality of the coding, usually by having two different coders code the data and then checking to see if they agree with each other, right? So when I was, sort of coming up through this process, I had to independently learn a lot of these techniques, right? But you can't be all things to all people. You can't learn every technique that is necessary to do research. So you really have to determine what others can do versus what you need to do when you're thinking about this step in understanding data analysis. And then finally, conducting analyses with the data. So learning statistics is really helpful when you're doing research in child psychiatry, really research in pretty much any area. So I had statistics in college as a psychology major, but I had long forgotten it by the time I was in residency, fellowship, and postdoc. So when I was a postdoc at WashU, we have a clinical and translational center called an ICTS. And they had a program for postdocs. And part of that program allowed you to take courses. So I took biostatistics again while I was yeah, a fellow and also a postdoc and sort of early faculty member, starting all these clinical programs. So balancing, taking, you think you're never going to take a class again, but sometimes you need to. And it was really, really helpful because early on I was able to do a lot of the sort of straightforward data analysis myself in my research studies and early manuscripts, which is really helpful because sometimes the statisticians get really busy and they don't quite understand your question or your data. And so that can be challenging. But once you get to maybe you're starting to use statistics that are beyond what you've learned, and that's when you need to consult with a statistician and or expert colleagues. Like I have a lot of colleagues that are psychology PhDs, and they are able. So okay, sorry, my daughter just texted me something. So I think she's okay. But unfortunately, she's at a residential program at a university. So I just need to let her know that everything will be fine. All right, sorry about that. That's another fun part of the job when you have a family and you're trying to balance your research, your clinical work, and your family. So back to what I was describing. So yeah, so there are a lot of psychology PhDs who have a lot of expertise in statistics that are higher level, especially when you're doing longitudinal studies. So being able to consult with colleagues to help you. And then lastly, there's Google. So a lot of times you're trying to figure out what's the best test for this kind of question or that kind of question. And Google can be your friend and leading to some really helpful websites that describe different types of analyses, and also sometimes finding code that you can use in your data analysis program. So really that's sort of the long and short of it. But you really do need to have a good mentor who knows how to do a study where the quality of the data is paramount, because bad data will lead to bad outcomes and incorrect analyses, and and that can really be devastating when you're sort of at the end of a study and realize that you made some sort of significant flaw along this pathway. All right, so talking specifically about how some of this applies to some of our studies, these are several of the studies that we have ongoing, and I'm going to just talk about a few of them because they have a lot of complex data. So the first study is the Early Life Adversity in Biological Embedding study that we call ELAB. And ELAB is a study of almost 400 maternal infant dyads. The moms were recruited during pregnancy, and then when the infants were born, we scanned them, and we scanned them again at ages 2 and 3. And we're now in our phase 2 of this study and scanning them at ages 6 and 8. But going all the way back to the beginning, not only did we get questionnaires from mom, we got blood from mom. We also got microbiome samples from mom. And then we got all of those same measures from the baby and the child over time, as well as questionnaire data, behavioral data, like getting cognitive and language and motor outcomes, and then doing psychiatric interviews with the moms, they're the primary caregiver, to get information on the child. So we have a lot of different types of data. That's why you see lots of different investigators involved with this study. Team science is really the way to go, but we have to be very intentional about how we collect this data, the burden to the participants. We've had to make a lot of changes along the way, and also making sure that the images that we're getting good data from the children and the infants. So really complex study with a lot of different types of data that we've had to utilize. And then the statistics for this study have been very complex. It's longitudinal. It has multiple time points, it has a lot of different types of data, and we're asking a lot of really significant questions, trying to understand some causal mechanisms. So we have worked very closely with statisticians on this study to make sure that we are using the right type of data analysis to answer the questions that we have. Similar longitudinal studies are Cuddle study, which is a study looking at prenatal cannabis use and offspring brain and behavior. And again, it's a multi-investigator study. And this, we recruited about 400 pregnant folks, about half that smoked or used, I should say, cannabis during pregnancy, the other half that did not. And again, you see we get a lot of different types of data from both the mom and the child, and a lot of different time points. And we just got a good score on the grant to bring the kids back at ages 3 and 4 and 5 and 6. So a lot of different types of data, a lot of time points. And it involved all these studies involve behavioral coding of parent-child interaction tasks. So we have to, have that sort of coding and checking the reliability of the coding that I mentioned before. So again, just a lot of data. And this is a situation where we're fortunate to have expert colleagues, Dr. Arpana Agwal and Ryan Bogdan, who helped co-lead the study with me, both of whom are very, very strong in statistics. And so a lot of the complicated questions we're asking with this data, they are kind of leading. And I'm more in charge of the assessment of the imaging, as well as making sure that basically the trains run on time. So most of the staff that works for the study are in my lab, and we make sure that we're acquiring really good data. And lastly is our longest running study, which is the preterm study. And as I mentioned, this was a study that I first started on when I was a child psychiatry fellow. And at that time, we were still enrolling participants, and also about to start the 2-year follow-up. So I was able to add all the social, emotional, and psychiatric assessments starting at age 2. And then my K was written on the age 5 cohort, and to do more psychiatric assessments that were a little bit more in depth. We brought the kids back 9 to 10 years old and obtained MRI images, as well as getting both parent and child report and interview on social, emotional, and psychiatric assessments. And that has just finished. And now we have the 14 and 15-year-olds coming back. And you can see all those boxes sort of give you a sense of all the different types of data that we get here. The really challenge with this study is retention, because the time points are really spread out, but we've been really fortunate to get more than 80% back along the way. And also just, again, a ton of different types of data, a lot more medical data in this cohort because of the extreme prematurity. So maintaining that data has been a fun challenge along the way. And as I meant, this is my daughter piloting at age 5, and this is my daughter, or 9, I should say. And then this is my daughter piloting again at age 15, the one that just texted me. So, it's always helpful if you're doing research to know what it's like for the participants. And also, like I said, to reduce participant burden is very helpful. Okay, I was just checking the chat because I saw that there were some questions in the chat. Oops, let's see. There we go. So I was told to end with 5 pearls that are related to research and to having a career in child psychiatry that involves research. So one of the things that I think can be extremely helpful, and that I mentioned I did, is to align your clinical work and your research focus, because they can inform each other. So if, I was working with preterm kids, so in research, so with my clinic, focusing on preterm children really helped me think about important scientific questions as I really saw the type of symptoms that tend to cluster together in that population. And the reason we even came up with the prenatal cannabis study is because we heard about from our OB friends how much cannabis use they were seeing in their pregnant participants. So if you can align what you're doing clinically with what you're researching, it just makes everything I don't know, a lot easier and makes it just a little bit more focused. And then you definitely need more than one mentor, and that's both in research and in the clinical work that you do. It's just really helpful to have, and I know you all have already had a session on mentoring, so I won't go much into that, but it's just helpful to have viewpoints from many different uh, people. And also, when you think you're done with everything when you finish fellowship, that is not the case. I continue to ask my colleagues various clinical questions, and Joan remains a mentor of mine, both clinically and in research. The third pearl is that hopefully you've seen that for me, that clinical research is a team sport. So a lot of the questions that we want to ask in child psychiatry are have multiple types of data and expertise that are needed to be able to answer them. So you want to find several collaborators that you work well with and that you trust, and that can give you the expertise that you need to answer questions. And it just makes it more fun, to be honest. And the distribution of tasks and responsibilities also makes it much more doable if you have multiple studies and also with clinical responsibilities. And then number 4 is your training may end, but learning does not. And so figuring out how you learn best, when you learn best, when you can write best, when you start writing papers and grants is really important. But just understanding that nobody's fully cooked when they come out of training in either the clinical realm or the research realm, and that learning will be a part of your life, whether you take formal courses or do training workshops, or just have to learn a different area of science as you ask more and more in-depth questions with your research. And then lastly, you want to let your passion and interests guide you. So I always tell my mentees, I don't want them researching what I want them to research. I want them to research what they're interested in. Research is hard. There's a lot of rejections in terms of papers getting rejected or grants not getting funded. And if you're in the research space doing things that don't really interest you, that you're not really passionate about, it makes all of that much, much, much more difficult. And so you will be a better scientist and a better researcher if your passion and interest guide you. And that's true in your clinical work as well. It's much more challenging to do a clinical work if you're working with a patient population that doesn't really interest you. So you definitely want to make sure that as much as possible, you're following your own interests. So that's all I have formally in slides for tonight. So I'm happy to take any questions that you guys might have. And I will stop sharing so that I can see you if you want to turn your camera on.
Thank you, Dr. Rogers. I have a question about like how is it working with 2 patient populations, working with both like mom and baby. Did you set out initially to do both things, working with 2 patient populations at one time? And if not, then how did you kind of get there? And what has made it difficult to work with 2 at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't intending as a child, during a fellowship to work with perinatal populations. It just sort of happened, right? But I think as someone who's interested in early childhood mental health, having a well caregiver is so important to making sure your patients are doing well. And that's really true, whether you're working in early childhood or all the way through adolescence in child psychiatry. So clinically, sort of switching your brain between adult child can be a little challenging, but it's fun, and setting up the clinics was different, and almost sort of the physician you have to be, right? Like the way that you interact with kids, especially young kids, is really different than how you interact with adults. But because I'm working with such young kids, I am spending a lot of time talking to parents anyway. So that part was not too challenging.
Thank you. We have some more questions. You mentioned attending a public high school. Do you feel your background influenced your research passion, and if it played a role in your research success?
Um, that's a good question. I think my background, my family made me really interested in like the social and emotional development of children. I have a lot of educators in my family. My grandmother was a counselor at schools. So I think that important to see a range of folks across the socioeconomic spectrum, right? To grow up with that was really helpful. And my kids go to public school for that reason. So for me, I think it was helpful. And in terms of you think about some of your friends, things you saw, things you knew were going on, and it can make you think about, why, how the home environment, the family, how economic disadvantage can impact, development, can impact trajectories. So I think it was helpful.
We have another question. You mentioned recruiting and not burdening participants to ensure good data. Can you explain more how you do so from a diversity and equity perspective?
Say that one more time. I'm sorry. I missed the beginning part.
You mentioned recruiting and not burdening participants to ensure good data. Can you explain more how you do so from a diversity and equity perspective?
Yeah, I should have mentioned more specifically, our studies, the ELAB studies specifically focusing on poverty and its impact, social disadvantage. Cuddle, all of our participants are recruited from our on-campus OB clinic for our underinsured and uninsured population. So almost all of our studies include either majority Black cohorts or 50-50, basically. So we're always thinking about, all of our participants is what we're doing in terms of the study design, acquiring data, appropriate for everybody, and without bias, right? So it's really the other, you could see the diversity of our lab in the picture, and that's been really important, I think, when you're working with diverse populations. So, recruiting and retaining participants is really important. We also provide a lot of support for our participants. So we provide transportation when necessary. We provide referrals to needed resources. So I think understanding that piece and trying to alleviate as much of the burden as possible. We're really flexible. Sometimes we do everything in one day. Sometimes we do things on 2 different days in terms of MRI and the behavioral assessments. We also, do a lot of questionnaires that can be done on their phones or via email. So they can have plenty of time to get them done. So we do really try to think about, what's going to be easiest for our participants, and burden is important. We ask for feedback when we pilot, and if we hear from participants like this is too much, like I can't do all this, I have a job, I've got this, I've got other kids, like this is too much, then we listen to that and we make changes. So it really is important to not just design studies that would be possible to do if you have good transportation, people who can watch your kids, and you know, just a whole host of other resources. If your participants don't have that, then you need to provide it. And so that's important. We think about that from the very beginning when we write grants, and we, for the budgets that we put in, we think about this is the proportion of participants we're going to have to provide transportation to, and or cab vouchers. And when we have little babies, we're not asking somebody to get on a bus or two to come see us. With a newborn, we send a car service to pick them up. So we budget for all of that. So it is something that you really have to think about.
Thank you. And that is the perfect segue to the next question we received about your K-23. And someone would like you to speak more about that transition from clinical fellow to kind of like what you do now. And then how do you go about acquiring funding?
So when I was a clinical fellow, I had a very restricted amount of time to do research. And then when I graduated, I immediately went on a grant called a T32, which is a postdoctoral fellowship. A lot of institutions have T32s, and so it protects a lot of your time. It pays for a lot of your salary, and then you can do, at least at our institution, 10% or 20% of your time can be clinical work. So you're hired both as a postdoc and then also as a clinical faculty member. So the transition was a little weird to go from seeing patients every single day to only seeing patients once a week. But it's really nice in those early years of a postdoc to have lots of time to be learning either how to do research and focusing on your research. So that was really nice. And then in terms of getting funding, a lot of institutions have internal grants that you can apply for early on, like when you're a postdoc. And then most people who want to be independent investigators usually go the path of obtaining a career development award. And that means, learning how to write your first grant, which honestly, of all the grants I've written, my career development grant was the hardest one because it was the first one. And so, but having good mentors around you that can help. And so most of our funding comes from the NIH, but you can also get funding from other smaller foundations to do research, and sometimes philanthropy. People will come to your division or department and want to donate money for research that's in a specific area. So, but usually you're either writing some level of a proposal or you're writing a full grant. And so learning how to write grants, it's really in kind of an art. And so you want to learn from people who are really good at getting grants. It's, important to see a lot of other grants, see grants that were funded, read them there's a really specific structure for NIH grants. And so it's really a skill that you develop and learn over time to write a good grant.
Thank you. We have another question, and first they want to tell you thank you for your vulnerability and transparency in sharing the difficulty of balancing life, family, clinical work, and research. Can you talk more about how you navigated that balance, and especially in the terms of how time-intensive research can be?
It is challenging. I had my daughter when I was a third-year resident, had my son my first year of my postdoc. So they've really been along for the ride from kind of the very beginning of their research career. What I've done over time is be very upfront about my prioritization of my family to all of my mentors and my supervisors. When I was a fellow, that meant telling one of my supervisors I had to leave clinic every day by 5:30 to go pick up my daughter from daycare, period. Like that was non-negotiable. And what I've tried to model over the years for the mentees that I have and the staff that I have is that I know you have a family, And that means sometimes you got to go. You got to you got to take them to the doctor. You got to take them to the dentist. You got to pick them up from school because they're sick. You know, I totally understand that. My kids are very busy athletically, and sometimes I have the laptop at a practice and I'm working on a grant or writing a paper while I'm watching somebody swim or play soccer. Like that's just how I've done it, is just to integrate work and life together, not try to have like these discrete times necessarily, but be flexible. I leave work. Sometimes I leave work at 3 because I got to go do something with a child. Somebody's got a lesson or someplace I got to go, and but I might be working there, or I might work later in the evening. But you also want to be like present with your children. So the times that you're with them, you're not always working, but times maybe when you're not with them while they're doing something else, you can. So that's how I've done it. Not always easy, but for me, prioritizing my kids, like I will cancel things, cancel meetings. I will move patients around if there's something that I have to be there for my children. So as child psychiatrists, I think we understand how important the parent-child relationship is, and the importance of being there for your children, right? So, and them feeling like a priority, which
Thank
is
you.
I'm like antsy about what's going on with my daughter. So I'm like recognizing that as soon as I'm finished with speaking with you guys, that I will need to call her and see what is going on.
Can you walk us through a day in the life? Like, what does a typical day look like for you between research, seeing patients, any other administrative tasks, since you are, on the leadership side and the director side of many different areas?
Yeah, so I shouldn't say I don't have like a typical day. I have a typical day of the week. So like my Mondays are a certain way and my Tuesdays are a certain way. So um Monday is a heavy research day for me, and it's a day that I do a lot of my supervising of my mentees. So lot research meetings, mostly on Mondays, and lab meeting. Tuesday is a mix between my we'll have our grand rounds on Tuesdays for our department, and then some more lab meetings, then mixed in with a little bit of other meetings that might be important that were related to something else. Wednesdays are a heavy administrative day with a lot of meetings related to the department. And sometimes I'm a deputy editor for JCAP, so sometimes we have meetings on Wednesdays. Thursdays, my clinic day. So half a day spent in clinic, and then some meetings are about the perinatal service are on Thursdays. And Friday right now, post-COVID, is my work from home day. And it is lots of different meetings, several of them related to the HBCD study, which is a large national consortium study that I'm a site PI for, but also on the leadership team. So I usually have 2 or 3 meetings related to that study on Fridays, in addition to other division responsibilities and some research meetings. So that's kind of how it's sprinkled around through the week. I like the fact that not every day is the same. I think keeps it interesting. So, but it did, that evolved over time. This is not necessarily the way you start when you first finish your fellowship, but it works for me.
How are we careful to avoid confounders or bias like the now debunked 30 million word gap? How do we get started with research for those of us early in our career? Case report, quality improvement. So those are 2 separate questions. They ask them back to back.
Okay. We have to be really careful about any assumptions that we're making when it comes to the research questions that we're asking with, various folks who are from different populations, right? And so you want to try in science as much as possible to be agnostic. Like, don't assume. one thing that I will share with you that has really bothered me when working with other researchers who don't work with these populations very often is the assumption that folks that are under-resourced or minoritized populations just don't want to do research, and it's just so hard to get them in research studies and so hard to retain them in research studies. Our experience is that if you treat your participants with respect and provide them with some level of benefit, so we do things like we give them the developmental testing results so that if they need to, give them to their pediatrician so they get resources, or give them to the school, in addition to the other resources that we referrals to various community agencies, we stay on top of that. And like I said, providing transportation. If you need to bring some extra children with you, that's fine. We have that we'll have other folks help watch them. So I just think that you don't want to go into any science with making any assumptions about the participants that you work with. And we're also looking at resiliency factors, things that a lot of these folks have that help them thrive. Literally, we have a paper out about called the Thrive Factor. So also not always approaching research from the side of risk and vulnerability, but also from, what are the strengths that a lot of the participants have, so that we can learn how to make those strengths available to as many folks as possible. And the second question was, I'm
How do
sorry.
we get started? How do we get started with research? If we're
Oh,
in our career, do we do case reports, quality improvement, join a project?
so many different ways, really. So definitely when you're a clinical, like when you're a resident, you don't have a ton of time unless you have like specific research electives. So case reports are really great way to get started in learning how to write a paper, how to write a manuscript. So if you have a really interesting patient or several really interesting patients, you want to do a case series, working with a senior mentor is a really great way. Another good way is, again, finding an established researcher in your department or area where they have an ongoing study where maybe you can do just a little part of it, right? And sometimes even if all you can do is go to their lab meetings and see some of the presentations from the other folks, just getting your feet wet with like, what is the research process? And quality improvement projects are another good way, because you might need to do some data analysis there. And so that's a good way to learn just some sort of straightforward data analysis, working with some folks that can help you with that. So I think any of those ways are really great. If you can get a research elective, that's really helpful. So you can spend some dedicated time on it. Learning how to read research papers so that you really understand the methods and the data analysis as much as possible is also really helpful.
Okay, we have one last question. It seems your research ties in heavily with advocating for improvements in the social environment. Do you integrate your work with advocacy? And if so, how?
Yes, I do. So one of the things that I've done is testified both at the state level and done congressional briefings at the federal level on the impact of the child tax credit, for instance, and why I would continue that. I do also to do advocacy in that way. Oh, so sorry. And I think advocacy is really important. And you can also do advocacy at your local level. So I've done a lot of advocacy with our hospital and hospital system around how we can make care more equitable and access to care more available for patients that are in our area. So yes, I think advocacy, I have a whole talk I give about advocacy and why physicians should be advocates. And even when I present my research, particularly on the impact of poverty on development, I always end it with a sort of a call to all of us that work with children, care about children, to be advocates about the impact that social determinants of health have on our patients, and doing our best to advocate for policies that we know would be helpful to them. So yes, I'm a big believer in advocacy.
Awesome. We just want to thank you again, Dr. Rogers, for spending some time with us today. It was a very enlightening and inspiring session, and I am sure there will be mentees reaching out to learn more from you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Please take a moment to complete the feedback form. I'm about to put it in the chat right now. And please mark your calendars for our upcoming session on Thursday, August 15th, featuring Dr. Horatio Hogman from Brown University and Dr. Magdalena Romanwitz from Mayo Clinic. Have a good evening. I am dropping the link right now. Thank you.
Thank you all. Good night.
Thank you, Dr. Rogers.